we have Sylvia Mukasa. Now, initially, Sylvia always assumed technology was used to do good, solving the problems and challenges humanity faces. She never realized that there was a dark side of technology and how deep those roots go. While technology has contributed to many things making life much easier, like using mobile money and shopping online and making robotics for the disabled, technology also has been used to discriminate. In many ways, technology uses the very things that define us, our race, age, gender, and sexuality, to deny access to opportunities, services, and control power to commit other injustices and unfair practices. In this chat today, Sylvia, founder and CEO of GlobalX Investments and GlobalX Innovation Labs, wants you to walk away with a basic understanding of what AI is, with a focus on algorithms, examples of how AI can be discriminatory, and actionable steps on how to combat this problem. Now, please help me welcome Sylvia and our moderator, Anastasia Robb. Welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Hunter. And hi, Sylvia. What a pleasure to have you with us today. Before we dive into this subject matter and the discussion, I would love to have you tell us all more about yourself, your work, your career journey, all that good stuff.
Right. Thank you very much, Anastasia. I'm so excited to be on this call today, and I'm dialing in from Enkare, Nairobi, a place of cool waters, also known as Nairobi, Kenya. I'm founder and CEO of GlobalX Investments Ltd and GlobalX Innovation Labs. GlobalX feeds into the innovation pipeline by closing the skilling, funding, and digital transformation gaps with a focus on emerging technologies. Our mission is to make innovations happen, and this is why it's very important for us to close these gaps. I'm also a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate, mainly championing for gender and racial equity. And in terms of gender, I work a lot with women in technology, especially on the African continent. And I've been doing this through different platforms. For example, Women in Tech Africa, which is a Pan-African organization with membership from over 30 countries and over 1,000 members. And in terms of racial equity, I've been part of different conversations, even on this very platform, Power to Fly, before. And I've also co-created what we call the Unlearning Journey, where we speak about different matters around racism and just how to make the world a better place. And so, I work with the BMW Foundation Responsible Leaders Network, where we co-create different conversations and write articles around racial equity. But I'm more focused on how technology actually perpetuates racism. And so a lot of the conversations I tend to have are around technology and race. And then I'm also very keen on inclusive development with a focus on Africa, just making sure that the African continent is not left behind when it comes to global development. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Excellent, amazing. Well, then let's dive right in. So, this morning I woke up, tried to count the number of times I've used technology to kick off my day, lost track after I opened like my 10th app. So needless to say, it's become the basis of our day-to-day lives, right? And I know personally, be lost without it. So I'd love to kick off the conversation by talking about digital discrimination, right? What is this? What is it? When and how did it start? And also maybe how has it kind of changed over the past several years, would you say?
Thank you. And it's very important for us to understand that term, digital discrimination. So digital discrimination has actually existed from before. It's not a new phenomenon. It's something that's been there. But what happened is during the pandemic, it was exacerbated because suddenly everyone was supposed to be online. Everyone was supposed to use some form of technology. And so what the pandemic did, it just brought it to the limelight that there's a serious problem and the major gaps that exist. So we've heard about the digital divide at some point, and what it basically means is the level or extent of access, adoption, and use of technology. So we are at different levels, right from country level to continental level to individual level. We are all at different levels in terms of our ability to use technology. And that is what defines the type of gap that exists and the kind of discrimination that is there, which is mainly brought about by the fact that we are in different locations, by our socioeconomic status, and also by our race, right? So we are affected very differently. And if I'm to give an example, for instance, when the pandemic came up, schools moved to remote learning, and the students really had different challenges. So, for example, when you look at the low-income countries, a lot of the children were left out in terms of access to technology and the use of it, because many of them could not afford connectivity, either through inability to get, to buy internet bundles or, home fiber or whatever infrastructure that they need to use to get onto online platforms. And then again, you find that a lot of teachers also lacked that capability to be able to connect with their students, just because they are from low-income countries, and also some of them are from areas that are not well connected. And when I talk about low-income countries, I'm mainly referring to many countries in the global south, having those kind of issues. And then again, when you look at work, again, a lot of people from the low-income economies again have the struggle. So if I'm to give an example, for instance, the price of internet in Ethiopia is astronomical. It costs an average of $424 per month to access internet in Ethiopia. It's the most expensive internet in the world. And you can imagine this is a country where income levels are low, but then again, the internet prices are high. So how many people are able to use that internet? And yet there are countries in the developed world that are paying so much less for connectivity. And then again, when you look at sub-Saharan Africa region, 6 out of the 10 most expensive countries in the world, 1 GB of mobile data are in sub-Saharan Africa, right? And then we also need electricity to connect to the internet and to use our gadgets. But then again, you find we have different levels of connectivity. So you find how we consume and how we are able to access technology is at different levels. And so there's some level of discrimination in terms of location, race, and socioeconomic status.
That makes a lot of sense. So digital discrimination in particular is defined by how we actually, our ability to consume the technology. Gotcha. Okay. And then over the years, especially in the past 2 years of the pandemic, it's kind of even had more drastic impact because of our kind of reliance on technology, internet access, all of that stuff during that period is how it's changed over the years. Okay. So then in a world where technology is equated with advancement and development, to what extent are people kind of ignoring the disparity that it creates between the privileged and those who can't access these resources?
Good question. You know what? Most of the time, people do not understand or even realize their privilege. unless you're well informed or keep abreast with international matters, and you also travel and mingle with different people, you sort of exist in a bubble. And so you're not aware of the inequalities. And even if you are, you really don't have a deep understanding of them. And I'll give a few examples. I'll touch a little bit on education and the inequalities, right? And just to paint a deeper picture around that. So UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank did a survey, which showed that 50% of children in the low-income countries did not participate in remote learning. 50%. And yet, these are the same kids we expect to get out there and be competitive in the global market. It becomes very difficult for those kind of children. And you know, those who are from privileged backgrounds or who are, you know, who are well off, who have enough money to afford gadgets, for example, don't realize that people who struggle to even just own a phone. Some people have never even seen a computer or used one. And yet this is pretty common in some parts of the world. So again, not realizing that not everybody is able to use these technologies, not everyone can afford them, not everybody has adequate skills to even use them. And unless you're put in that environment where you begin to interact with a lot of people and also learn a bit more, you'll tend to realize that some people don't realize what a challenge it is for others to be able to be to use technology as much as they're able to. When we look at Zoom calls as well, right? We are on a call right now. You might be thinking, oh, it's pretty easy to get on a call and have a conversation, but yet some people really have to budget and think, you know, how am I going to get money to buy bundles to sustain me through a call, for instance, and yet somebody else, it's really easy, just, you know, no challenges whatsoever. The other thing I'd like to point out is entrepreneurship. So I'm passionate about entrepreneurship and also investments. And one thing I'd say is the kind of schools we go to, the kind of institutions we are affiliated with, again, give us a lot of privilege. So if I'm to look at the African continent, for example, in entrepreneurship, we see that there's a lot of American venture capital and private equity investors who are dominating Africa, but they are mainly funding white foreign founders as Black entrepreneurs struggle to raise funding. So in Kenya, for instance, only 6% of startups that received more than $1 million in 2019 were led by locals. Yet you find white founders who leave the US, come to Kenya, and raise millions of funds just purely because they attended the Harvards and the MITs. And so they have an upper hand, even though they are new to continents like Africa. They tend to get funding much more easily compared to the Black founders or the locals. And someone actually did, someone in Seattle, they did research, and this is what they found out, that a white founder is 47,000% more likely to be funded in Kenya than in the US. And yet white people make 1% of the population in Kenya. And he discovered that 65% of expatriate founders, mainly from the US, the UK, Italy, Denmark, and Germany, had not even lived in Kenya before they started their companies, but they were able to raise so much funding. And a lot of them will not realize that the white privilege plays out. Yeah, because you look and you're thinking, oh, maybe these people are just not good enough. That's why they're not getting the funding. But yet there are biases in how funding is done. A lot of people, a lot of investors feeling like they can only relate well with, you know, those they can relate with because they trust them, and it cuts out others. So those little privileges play out. And, you find a lot of tech startups, even on the African continent, having a lot of white founders compared to Black people.
Wow, I'm definitely one of those people that's guilty of the ignorance. Those are pretty staggering statistics.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, in terms of moving from talking about digital discrimination, what are some of the biases and discriminations that you see that have come to the surface with the growing impact of AI specifically?
Right. So a lot of those biases and discrimination have been seen through gender, race, location, and power control. So I'll just give a few examples of that. So when you look at the tech industry, for example, Google's workforce is comprised of 2.5% Black people. And when you look at Facebook and Microsoft, it's about 4%, right? And that's just one example of what's happening in the tech industry. And when you look at the representation of those working in AI, in the AI fields, in these industries, there's only 18% women across the world. When you look at what's at the AI conferences and the authors that present at these conferences, again, there's only 18% of women, and men, there's 80% of AI professors who are men. So when you look at gender, those kind of statistics start to play out. And there's no public data on trans workers or other gender minorities. And for Black workers, the picture is even worse. So just giving an example in terms of gender and how that works. And there was a study that was done by Joy Bulamini, who's the founder of the Algorithmic Justice League. She did a study called the Gender Shades, and it did show that women were not easily identifiable with AI as compared to men. And then there was also the race bit of it, where AI tends to not be able to recognize Black faces or people in color compared to white people. And then there was also, there's also the challenge with facial recognition. So for instance, an African-American man in the US state of Michigan was arrested for shoplifting, and yet he didn't know anything about. This man was taken into custody after being handcuffed outside of his house in front of his family. Luckily, it became clear that he wasn't the person that should have been arrested because there was a still picture from the store security cameras. And that's what made the police realize that that wasn't the right person. And this just goes back to, again, the kind of models that are used to train algorithms. Most of the time, people of color being left out, and also sometimes being falsely accused for crimes they've not committed, purely because facial recognition doesn't really work well with people of color. And again, when we look at chatbots and virtual assistants, which are pretty common nowadays, we find, for example, Africa being left behind. When you look at natural language processing, which is the technology behind enabling the use of these chatbots and virtual assistants, there is inadequate pre-trained data sets with African languages. Now, Africa has 2,000 languages, and yet those data models are not inclusive. So what we find is there's a misunderstanding of African names, there's a misunderstanding of African culture, there's a misunderstanding of history and African history, and even accents are poorly interpreted because the data is just not available. So unless we start building technologies that recognize race, that recognize gender, that recognize location in different continents, then we are bound to see a lot of serious issues with AI. And when I talk about power, It's about organizations and how they control what kind of technology is built, who it serves, and who it benefits in the end. So there's what we call digital colonization, where a lot of companies, big companies, tech companies that are based in the West, are busy collecting data on the African continent, for instance, and yet and using it without the knowledge of the users. So these things really need to be addressed, and to ensure that AI does not perpetuate discrimination biases.
That kind of thank you, Sylvia. That kind of leads into my follow-up question, of like the so like, where do we go from here? The so what question, right? Of like, as AI takes over, you can't help but kind of wonder if the conflict between the efficiency it provides and the ignorance and discrimination that it creates can be so easily resolved. You've kind of talked about some of the reasons that the root causes of why that ends up happening. But do you envision a possibility where AI and technology can become more inclusive, and how?
Definitely. So the thing is, algorithms are basically math and code. And what happens is it's humans who use our data to, to put these two things together, the math and the code, to enable the algorithm to make decisions. So it begins with us as humans, right? This algorithm will work based on how we as humans train them, and also how we deal with our own biases and discriminatory habits. Because these are trained machines. They lack consciousness, they have no emotion. They cannot function without human ability. So it begins with us as humans first. And then the other thing is to address the deeper issues with workplace cultures, power asymmetries, harassment, exclusionary hiring practices, unfair compensation, and tokenization that are causing people to leave or avoid working in the AI sector and in technology altogether. So when I talk about solving these challenges and ensuring that the biases and the discrimination don't happen, we have to address the workplace diversity in the first place. So I talked about academia and 80% professors being men. So maybe in academia, for example, we could have greater diversity in all spaces of AI research, so that there's representation of all genders and all races, and the different groupings represented, so that we are not leaving out certain sections of the population. And then we have to change our hiring practices as well, to ensure that they are diverse, have underrepresented groups in our teams, and create more pathways for contractors and temporary workers and vendors to become full-time employees. We also have to increase the number of people of color, the number of women, underrepresented groups at senior level, because remember, this is where decisions are made. So if there's underrepresentation at senior level, then a lot of issues go unaddressed or unattended to. And then we also have to address the biases and discrimination in the AI systems themselves, okay? So we have to test the systems for biases. We have to ensure that there's transparency, which means when I talk about transparency, what I mean is we need to be able, the people who build technology need to communicate why certain technologies are being built and for who. Because sometimes they are serving, companies that don't have good intentions, or clients who are requesting for technologies that are of no good or discriminate against other populations. There's also need for regulation. So there have to be laws that push for accountability for the impacts of the practices on accuracy, on fairness, on bias, on discrimination, on privacy and security. And then we have to have structural changes. So we need to get rid of tech monopolies, right? The big tech companies tend to control a lot of what happens with our data and how technology is consumed. So we have to have structures that dismantle those tech monopolies. And then the other is governance of technology. And one good way is to give power to Black and Brown communities. So for example, we can have cooperatives that fight for fair pay and better work practices, especially in the gig economy, so that we are not having technologies that are simply perpetuating poverty and also discriminatory practices.
Thank you for that. So that was super comprehensive. I was like writing a list. There's like 8 different. Yeah, there's a lot. It's impressive.
Yeah.
And taking it from so many different angles, right? From within the companies that create this, to creating a diversity of companies who have access to this and building this technology, to like the policy side of things I didn't think about that at all. There's like, you need to also enforce that and regulate that.
Yes. Yeah. So some of I've written a few articles before. There's one I've written about algorithms and AI practices and algorithms and discrimination in the gig economy. The gig economy is basically the platform economy. So we've all used the Ubers, use Airbnb, we shop online. Those are examples of platforms, and how there's a lot of discrimination that we never really realize goes on those platforms. And I'd shared that link. I hope someone can share it in the chat section, so people can go and read that. I've given pretty good examples on how that works. So for example, how work is assigned to Uber drivers, for instance, in other apps that people use to move around. So you find there's discrimination even how we tip our drivers. Black drivers not being tipped as much as white drivers, for instance. And then the reviews that are given. Again, there's biases on the reviews that are given on these platforms. So you find some people who literally do not like a certain race, and they will just give a poor rating, and then it affects those people, getting jobs in future, things like that. So there's a lot that goes on the big platforms that is very discriminatory, and we rarely realize what is going on. So yeah, if you can read that, that will give you a deep dive into understanding how platforms are perpetuating racial inequities.
Sylvia, thank you so much. We have about a minute left, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to also kind of share any other ways that people can like connect with you or read your work, more about your work. I know that our team is dropping that into the tab, but if you can make a call out for it as well, that would be awesome.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So you can follow me on Twitter at Sylvia Mukasa. I post a lot of stuff around technology investing and gender and race matters. And then you can also follow me on LinkedIn or ask for a connection on LinkedIn. Sylvia Mukasa, again, the link will be put in the chat section. And then you can also follow our work, GlobalX Investments Ltd. You just Google that, you'll see our platform, and we're also on the social media platforms as well. And some of the articles I also write can be found on the 2030 website, 2030.com. It's a platform run by the BMW Foundation Responsible Leaders.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Sylvia. This was a really wonderful, insightful rather, conversation. I really appreciate it.